My mother called me on a Tuesday morning, her voice carrying that particular honeyed warmth she reserved for requests, and said, "Sweetheart, the utility bill has arrived. The electric is due by Friday." I let her finish. Then I said, very quietly, "Call Lauren. She has the inheritance. I have a life to fund." The silence on her end lasted 11 full seconds. I counted them. And what happened after that silence? What my mother did, what my sister did, what the next 4 months looked like for all of us, is the story I've been waiting long enough to tell properly. It starts, the way these things always do, not with the betrayal, but with the ordinary, with the version of my life I was living before I understood what I was actually living inside. And that version was so familiar and so daily and so completely taken for granted that I sometimes struggle now to remember it without filtering it through everything I know now. But I want to try, because the ordinary matters. The ordinary is where the trap was set, and you can't understand a trap without understanding the ground it was built on.
My name is Catherine, Kate to everyone except my mother, who has always used the full name with a particular emphasis that functions as a mild correction, as in, you are who I named you, not who you have decided to become. I'm 34, and for the past 6 years I've worked as a senior project coordinator for an architectural firm in Columbus, Ohio, which is a job that requires a specific combination of precision and interpersonal management that I'm genuinely good at, and that pays me well enough to live comfortably, but not so well that I ever stopped noticing the numbers. My apartment is on the 3rd floor of a building in the short north, with big windows that face east and a kitchen I have made genuinely pleasant through years of small, patient investments. A good knife set, proper pots, the kind of coffee maker that takes 15 minutes but produces something worth the time. I made coffee there every morning at 6:40, before work, standing at the counter and watching the light change on the buildings across the street, thinking about the day ahead in that pleasant, unfocused way of people whose mornings belong to them.
My parents, Richard and Donna Alderman, lived in the house I had grown up in, a colonial revival in Westerville, about 20 minutes north of my apartment. The house had 4 bedrooms, a formal dining room my mother used 3 times a year, a garden that my father had maintained with a devotion bordering on religious conviction, and a mortgage that had been paid off when I was in college, which meant what was left was entirely owned, entirely theirs, and worth, by the last estimate anyone had distressed out loud, somewhere in the neighborhood of $380,000. That number had floated in our family's ambient awareness for years, the way large numbers associated with parents' houses do when families acknowledge without directly discussing that someday the house will pass to someone. Someday was not something any of us had examined too closely. It was the kind of conversation no one quite wanted to initiate, because initiating it required thinking about things no one wanted to think about. My sister Lauren was 31. She lived 12 minutes from our parents, in a condo that my parents had helped her purchase 7 years ago, a detail that in retrospect I had filed under "they've always been generous with Lauren" and left there without pulling on the thread. Lauren was the younger one, and the dynamic that comes with that in certain families had calcified early and held its shape throughout our adult lives. She was the one who needed a little more help, a little more patience, a little more of everything, and our parents provided it with a warmth and consistency that I had always told myself was not about preference, but about circumstance. Lauren had gone through a difficult period in her mid-20s, a bad relationship, a job loss, a stretch of real unhappiness that I had witnessed and taken seriously and tried to support as a sister should. Our parents had supported it more materially, the condo down payment, a year of supplemental income while she rebuilt, small and not so small financial assists that were never discussed with me directly, but that I was aware of in the way you're aware of a wind without being told there's weather coming. I had not needed any of that.
I want to be clear about this, without sounding like I'm making a virtue of it. I hadn't needed help because I had arranged my life to not need help, which required a certain specific kind of discipline and a willingness to make choices that were sometimes hard in the short term. I had taken out student loans and paid them back over 7 years without ever asking my parents to contribute. I had moved into entry-level apartments and stayed in them longer than was comfortable because the math required it. I had said no to things, many things, in the quiet way of someone who has decided that independence is worth the cost. My parents had watched all of this with what I had interpreted as approval, a certain pride in my self-sufficiency that came through in the way my father talked about me to his friends, in the way my mother said, "Kate always figures it out," when anyone asked about my career or my life. I had taken "Kate always figures it out" as a compliment. I understand now that it was also a permission structure. It meant, Kate doesn't need us to figure it out.
Which meant, we don't have to. The practical support I had been providing to my parents for the past 4 years had developed the way these things develop, gradually, through a series of reasonable individual decisions that accumulated into something much larger than any single decision had seemed at the time. It started when my father's knees went bad and he needed help with the garden maintenance that had always been his domain, which led to me hiring and paying for a landscaping service every 2 weeks from April through October. It continued when my mother's car needed replacing, and I had offered this, I want to be honest about that, nobody asked, contributed $5,000 to the purchase of the new one. It expanded into a monthly arrangement, loosely defined but practically consistent, in which I paid their cell phone bill, their streaming subscriptions, their home internet, and had set up an auto pay for their electric and gas accounts from my checking account, a total of approximately $480 a month that had been flowing from my account to their life for 38 consecutive months without discussion or review. The reason I had set up the auto pay was efficiency. I am a person who likes things handled, and my parents were not great at managing the digital infrastructure of their own bills. My father was 80% comfortable with technology, and my mother was 20% comfortable, and together they averaged to a household that occasionally forgot to pay things online and then was surprised when something lapsed. I had set up the autopay during a Sunday visit when I discovered their internet had been shut off for 2 days because a bill had slipped through the cracks, and I had thought, I can fix this in 10 minutes. I fixed it in 10 minutes. I did not think about what I was building. I did not think about the word precedent. I thought about efficiency, and I thought about love in the practical, action-based way my family had always expressed it, and I set up the autopay and drove home and felt, as I usually did after solving a manageable problem, quietly satisfied. Lauren, during all of this, was not contributing financially to our parents' lives in any comparable way. She visited often, more often than I did, truthfully, because she lived closer and because her work schedule was more flexible. She did the kinds of things that presence enables, stopping in with groceries, watching a movie with my mother on a Tuesday afternoon, driving my father to a doctor's appointment I couldn't make because I was in a meeting. Those things were real, and I don't want to diminish them. But the money flowing in our parents' direction from their children was flowing almost entirely from me, which I had understood intellectually and not quite consciously registered as something requiring recalibration. It was simply the arrangement. Lauren's presence, my infrastructure, the way our family had quietly divided the tasks. The first thing I noticed, the first thing I registered and then deliberately put down, was a phone call in March, about 8 months before everything broke open. I had called my parents on a Sunday evening, the regular weekly call that I maintained partly out of genuine affection and partly out of the particular sense of filial obligation that had been built into me at a molecular level by a mother who believed that weekly calls were a moral minimum. My father answered, which was slightly unusual because my mother typically answered first, and there was a quality to his voice, a careful pleasantness, the voice of a person who has been reminded at something and is now managing their tone around it, that I noticed and filed. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, and then he handed the phone to my mother, and she was warm and affectionate in her specific way, but she was also slightly distracted, and at one point there was a muffled sound, and she said, "Just a minute," and I heard her say something to my father in a low voice, and the thing I almost heard, not quite caught but almost, was a name that might have been Lauren's. And then my mother was back, and we talked for 10 more minutes, and I thought, nothing. It was nothing. But I kept it. The way you keep things you don't know what to do with, not in your memory exactly, not as a specific concern, but in some holding area of consciousness that collects small irregularities the way a drain collects debris, slowly and without drama, until there's enough of it to be worth noticing. There was also, in April, a conversation I had with my mother about the house. Or not quite a conversation, more of a comment my mother made in passing during one of my Sunday visits about how they had been thinking about the future and had had a very good meeting with their financial planner. She said it with the particular breeziness of someone who has decided something and wants credit for the decision without the discussion of it. I said that sounded responsible and asked if there was anything I should know, and she said with that same breezy precision, "Oh, nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart." I drank my coffee. I looked at the kitchen I had grown up in, the yellow walls, the white cabinets, the rooster clock above the stove that had been there since I was 9, and I thought, that is an odd phrasing. Nothing for you to worry about is a specific evasion. It answers a question you didn't ask by implying the question was worry, when the question was actually information. I thought about that for the rest of the drive home, and then I let it go, because I had a full work week starting Monday, and the most I had to go on was a phrasing I hadn't liked. The discovery, when it came sideways. It came not through a document I found or a phone I shouldn't have looked at, but through a conversation I wasn't supposed to have, in a context that was so unremarkable that it took me a full minute after it happened to understand what I had just learned. I was at a birthday dinner for my mother's friend Pauline, not a close friend of mine, more an extended family friend, the kind of person I had known since childhood through proximity, and who had remained a fixture in the ambient social world of my parents' lives. The dinner was at Pauline's house, 12 people around a long table, and I was seated next to Pauline's husband, Greg, who worked in insurance, and was the kind of genuinely pleasant person who makes good dinner company because he is curious about everything and judgmental about nothing. We had been talking for 20 minutes about my work when Greg said, very casually, "Your folks seem really pleased about getting everything squared away. Good for them to have that sorted." He said it with the comfortable assurance of someone referencing a known thing, a shared fact. He topped off his wine. He asked me about a project I had mentioned. I finished my dinner. I drove home. I sat in my car in the parking garage of my building for 11 minutes, and I thought about what Bright had said, and the specific quality of its casualness. The thing he had said assuming I already knew it, which meant it was the kind of thing that people knew. And then I went upstairs, and I stood at my kitchen counter, and I thought about the meeting with the financial planner, and the breezy, nothing for you to worry about, and Lauren's condo down payment 7 years ago, and the word, everything. Greg had said getting everything squared away. Not things. Everything. And then I thought, what if I'm not in it? I want to describe what happened in my body at that moment, because it deserves precision. There was no dramatic collapse, no sudden tears, no physical crisis. What happened was quieter and in some ways more disturbing. I felt my chest go cold in a line, from sternum to throat, as if someone had drawn a cold finger down the inside of me, and then everything contracted. My breath shortened without my telling it to. My hands tightened on the counter's edge. My vision went very clear and very narrow, in the way vision goes when the brain is redirecting resources from perception to processing. I stood there gripping the counter and breathing in short, careful intervals and thinking, I need to know, not what I think, what is actually true. I called my Aunt Patricia the next morning. Patricia was my father's older sister, 71, retired from teaching, with the particular combination of directness and warmth that characterizes people who have spent 30 years in a classroom managing other people's children and have emerged still liking them. Patricia and my mother had always had a relationship that was civil and respectful rather than warm, which meant Patricia sometimes knew things about my parents' decisions that came through the family network in ways my mother had not specifically controlled. I asked her how she was. We talked for 15 minutes, and then I said carefully, "Aunt Pat, can I ask you something?" And she said, "Of course, Kate. in the tone that meant she was already anticipating what it was. "Do you know if Mom and Dad have updated their will recently?" I asked. There was a pause, one of those pauses that contains a decision. And then Patricia said, quietly, and with a care that itself told me something, "I think you should talk to your parents directly, sweetheart." And I said, "I think they're not going to tell me unless I already know." Another pause. "Lauren told me something in passing," Patricia finally said, "at Christmas. I assumed your mother had talked to you." She paused again. "The estate is going to Lauren, all of it, as far as I understand." Patricia said your mother said, and here she stopped for a moment. And when she continued, her voice was careful in the particular way of someone quoting something they wish they weren't. "Your mother said Lauren needs it more." The phone was in my hand, and my hand was very still. The kitchen was very quiet. The coffee maker had just finished, and the room smelled of dark roast, and the morning light was coming through the east windows in that particular way it had. And all of those sensory details were absolutely present and absolutely irrelevant. Background to the single sharp fact now sitting in the center of my consciousness. Lauren needs it more. 38 months of auto payments, $5,000 toward a car, 4 years of landscaping bills, $480 a month, every month. Total expenditure over the period, approximately $18,000. All of it, every bit of it, contributed from my life to their lives, while their entire estate, $380,000 minimum, plus whatever savings and investments existed beyond the house, was designated in a document I had not seen and had not been told about, for my sister. Because Lauren needs it more. I told Patricia I needed to go. She said, "Kate," in a voice that was full of things she didn't say, and I said, "I know." "I'll call you." I hung up and I put the phone face down on the counter, and I pressed both palms flat on the surface next to it, and I looked at the coffee maker, and I breathed. And then something interesting happened. I did not cry. I had expected to cry. Grief and rage and hurt tend to express themselves that way, in my experience. But what arrived instead was not wet or loud, but cold. A specific, useful cold, the temperature of something that has decided. I thought about the autopay account settings on my laptop. I thought about how simple it would be to log in and cancel them. I thought about how no one had asked me to set them up, and no one had thanked me for maintaining them. And no one had thought to tell me that the people whose bills I had been quietly paying for 4 years had decided, in a meeting with a financial planner, that everything they had built was going to go to someone else. And I thought, fine. Then it goes to someone else. And the bills go to someone else too. I opened my laptop. I canceled the electric autopay. I canceled the gas autopay. I canceled the cell phone plan, which, as the account holder, I could do with 3 taps. I canceled the internet and the streaming subscriptions. It took 9 minutes. I did it with the same efficiency with which I had set everything up 38 months ago. And when it was done, I closed the laptop and I poured a cup of coffee, and I sat down at my kitchen table, and I thought about whether I was going to call my parents to tell them what I had done. I decided I was not. I decided that the way I had not been told was the same way they would not be told, in the ambient, unannounced way of something that simply stops arriving, a shift in the current that you only notice when you reach for what was there and find it gone. But I want to be clear about something, because it matters to the story, and it matters to who I am. What I did next was not only about canceling auto payments. I recognized, sitting at that table with my coffee, that I was in a situation I did not fully understand yet, that I had processed one piece of information through my aunt, and that pieces of information have context, and that acting on incomplete context leads to mistakes. I was certain of the auto payments decision. That required no additional information, because the logic was self-contained. But the full picture, the will, the reasoning, the extent of what I did and didn't know, that required more. I was going to get more, but first I was going to let the current stop flowing and see what happened when it did. I called my closest friend, Melissa, that evening. Melissa had known me since college, and she had the specific quality I most needed right then. Not sympathy, exactly, though she had plenty of that, but the ability to sit with me in the clarity of a thing without immediately trying to soften its edges. I told her everything in one long pour, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How much over 4 years?" And I told her the number, approximately $18,000, and she made a sound that was short and specifically expressive, and then said, "Okay, what are you doing?" And I told her, and she said, "Good."
"What else?" And I said I needed to understand the full picture of the will and the estate planning before I decided anything beyond the immediate action. And she said, "Do you want me to come over?" And I said yes. And she was there in 40 minutes with Thai food, and the particular brisk practicality of a person who understands that what a crisis sometimes needs most is company and protein. The call from my mother came 28 days after I canceled the auto payments. 28 days. That was how long it took, nearly a month, for the bills to accumulate and come due and go unpaid enough times that the situation had moved from inconvenient to urgent in my parents' household, and for my mother to call me about it, which told me a great deal, actually. It told me that for 28 days they had managed without the electric auto pay failing dramatically, which meant the prior payments had left enough buffer. It told me that neither of my parents had noticed the cell phone plan change for nearly 3 weeks. They were on it, using it, apparently without the disruption triggering an investigation into its status.
It told me that the internet had gone down at some point during those 28 days and been resolved through some other means because there was no panicked call about that. The first call was about the electric bill, and my mother's voice when she delivered this information had that specific honey warm register I mentioned. "Sweetheart, the utility bill has arrived." The tone of a woman who is reporting a small domestic inconvenience that she expects will be handled, the way such things had always been handled, by the daughter who handles things. I let her finish. I held the phone in my hand and listened to her explain that the electric was due by Friday, and that they weren't sure what had happened with the auto pay because it usually just went through. And was everything okay with my account? And she was sure it was just a glitch. I listened to all of it, and then I said very calmly and very clearly, "Call Lauren. She has the inheritance. I have a life to fund." The 11 seconds of silence that followed were the loudest 11 seconds I had experienced in years. I counted them because I needed something to do with the part of my brain that wasn't occupied with being absolutely still and absolutely certain. On the 12th second, my mother said, in a completely different register from the honey warm one, a register I had never heard from her before, tight and sharp and with something that might have been the beginning of panic underneath it. "Excuse me?" "I know about the will, Mom," I said. My voice was level. "I know about the meeting with the financial planner. I know the estate is going to Lauren, and I know you made that decision without telling me while I was paying your utility bills." I paused. "The utility account is in my name, and the auto pay is canceled. The cell phone plan is also canceled. The internet has been handled separately, I assume, since I didn't hear about it. I'd recommend calling Lauren about the electric by Thursday, since it's due Friday." There was another silence, shorter this time, 6 seconds, and then my mother said, "Kate, we need to talk about this. You don't have the full picture." "I'd love the full picture," I said, with a genuine absence of sarcasm that I think surprised her. "I would love to understand the reasoning. I'm available Saturday morning. You can come here or I can come there, and we can have that conversation with all of us present, including Lauren and Dad, and I'll listen to everything you want to say. But the bills are in my name, and they're canceled, and that part is not part of the conversation." I ended the call. I set the phone on my kitchen counter next to the coffee maker, and I looked at it for a moment, and then I went and sat down on my couch, and I felt, this is the honest truth, not triumph, not relief, but a low, spreading tiredness that was the particular fatigue of having been a certain kind of daughter for a very long time and having just stopped. That tiredness was real, and it needed to be honored, so I sat with it for a while
before I picked up my phone and texted Melissa. She called. I said what I said. Melissa texted back in 90 seconds. Tell me everything. I called her. We talked for an hour. By the end of the hour, the tiredness had converted into something cleaner and more functional, and I went to bed at a reasonable time and slept more soundly than I had in 3 weeks.
I knew, though, that the Saturday conversation was going to be the thing. The phone call had been the opening move, simple, clear, irrevocable, but the conversation was going to be where the full shape of the situation would have to be confronted, and I did not want to go into it underprepared. I had canceled the bills, and I had said what I said, and those things were done and not reversible. But I still didn't know the full legal picture of the will. I didn't know what reasoning my parents would offer, and I didn't know whether there was anything else, any additional piece of information, any other layer that I hadn't yet found. The experience of discovering you've been operating on incomplete information creates a specific new suspicion of your own assessments, a vigilance about what else you might be missing. I had learned this the hard way, and I was not going to make the same mistake twice. I made an appointment with an attorney.
Not because I planned to contest the will. My parents were living, the will was not yet operative, and an elder law attorney's first words on the subject of will contests are almost always discouraging for reasons both legal and practical, but because I wanted to understand my position. I wanted to know what I was working with, what I could and couldn't do, and what the landscape looked like from a professional perspective. The attorney's name was Margaret Hollins, and her office was in a building near the courthouse downtown, in a suite that smelled of old paper and window cleaner, and had a waiting area with chairs that had clearly absorbed decades of anxious people. Her assistant offered me water. I accepted it and held the glass. Margaret herself was somewhere in her late 50s, with reading glasses and a directness that I respected immediately. I told her the situation in the organized way I tell everything, chronologically, with specifics. The financial contributions, the approximate total, the will situation as I understood it through my aunt, the canceled bills, the phone call with my mother.
Margaret listened and took notes in a yellow legal pad, and when I finished, she took off her reading glasses and looked at me with the particular expression of someone who is about to say something you need to hear rather than something you want to hear. "You can't contest a will in Ohio while the testators are living," she said. "You know that." I said I did. "And without a formal agreement, the contributions you made to their expenses are presumed to be gifts. There's no legal mechanism to recover them as a debt, absent a written loan agreement, which doesn't exist." I said I understood. "So from a purely legal standpoint," Margaret continued, "what you've done, canceling the bills, is entirely within your rights, since the accounts were in your name, and what you haven't done is anything that creates legal exposure for you." She paused. "What you're really asking me, I think, is not what you can do legally, but what you should know before Saturday." "Yes," I said. "Then what you should know is this. If the estate plan is what your aunt described, your sister stands to receive the full estate at your parents' death." The current value, by your estimate, is somewhere around $400,000, including the house and probable savings. Your total contributions over 4 years are approximately $18,000. She let that sit for a moment. "That's not nothing, but in the context of what you're describing, the more significant number isn't the 18,000, it's the principal. And principal, unfortunately, is not a legal category." I thought about that for a moment. "What about the condo?" I asked. "The down payment they gave Lauren 7 years ago?" Margaret made a note. "How much?" "I don't know exactly. I know it was substantial. Lauren's condo is assessed of around $240, and 7 years ago the market was," I calculated. "My best guess is $40,000 to $50,000. If that's accurate, and if they didn't equalize it with a corresponding gift to you, and if the estate plan doesn't account for it as an advancement against Lauren's share, then you have an argument, not a legal argument, but a moral argument, that the disparity is significantly larger than the will alone suggests." She set down her pen. "That's an argument for Saturday."
"Not for a courtroom." She looked at me steadily. "Are you going to Saturday?" "Yes," I said. "Good. Go prepared. And one more thing." She leaned forward slightly.
Whatever your parents say about their reasoning, whatever justification they offer, let them finish. Don't interrupt. The thing people most regret in these conversations is cutting off the other person before they fully expose their position. Let them expose it completely. Then respond. I left her office with a cleaner sense of the terrain. The legal picture was what it was. Not in my favor in any actionable way, but not catastrophic either. What I had was the moral ground, the documented history of contributions, and the Saturday conversation, which was going to be the place where everything that had been unspoken would finally have to be spoken. And I was going to go into it having thought about every possible thing they might say and every possible response I might give, with the thoroughness I brought to the professional projects I managed for a living. This was, I thought, as important as any of those. The night before Saturday was not a comfortable night. I want to give it its due, because these nights before difficult conversations deserve to be described honestly. I went to bed at 11 and was fully awake by 1, and I lay in the dark and thought about everything, not in a productive spiral, but in the genuine pre-dawn inventory that comes when something important is the next day's first order of business. I thought about the specific memory of being 14 and winning the school's academic award, and coming home to find my parents in the kitchen, beaming, genuinely proud. My father saying, "That's my girl," in the particular tone he used when he meant it completely. My mother taking me out for dinner, just the two of us, to a restaurant I had chosen because it was the one I had always wanted to try. I thought about the reality that those parents and the parents who had signed a will document without telling me were the same people, that neither version erased the other, and that the complexity of that was something I was going to have to hold without resolving it cleanly, because some things don't resolve cleanly, and demanding that they do is a way of lying to yourself. I thought about Lauren. I had been trying to keep Lauren in the category of beneficiary of a decision made by other people, rather than co-conspirator, because I didn't yet know how much Lauren knew, or when she had known it, and assigning responsibility without information was one of the things I was most careful to avoid. But I was also honest with myself, alone in my apartment at 2 a.m, that if Lauren had known, if she had been party to the decision, if she had advocated for it, or simply accepted it with the silence of someone who knew what the alternative would cost, then what I felt about that was not going to be something that fit into the word disappointed. I didn't have a word for it yet. I was saving that for Saturday when I would know. At 3 a.m, I got up and made tea. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug I'd had since grad school, blue stoneware, a little chipped on the handle, and I looked at the table surface and I thought about the word sweetheart, my mother's word, the word she had used on the phone when she called about the electric bill, delivered in that warm managerial tone. Sweetheart, the utility bill has arrived, as if nothing had changed. As if I were still the same Kate who set up the auto pay in 10 minutes and drove home feeling quietly satisfied. I thought about what I had said in response, and the 11 seconds of silence, and I felt something that was not entirely unlike satisfaction, but was cooler and more deliberate than satisfaction, the feeling of having said the true thing, directly, without ornamentation or apology, which is both harder and simpler than most people think. I went back to bed at 4 and slept until 7. I made coffee. I got dressed in the specific way I dress when I need to feel fully myself, well-fitting clothes, nothing that requires managing, jewelry that is simple and mine. I checked my bag, the notepad on which I had written the night before the specific numbers I wanted to have accessible, the monthly average, the 38-month total, the estimate of the condo down payment, the current assessed value of the house. Not because I planned to present them like an invoice, but because having them written down meant I wouldn't have to reach for them in the middle of a conversation that was going to require all my cognitive resources for other things. I drove to Westerville. I was 5 minutes early. I sat in my car in front of the house with the red maple in the front yard. My father had planted it the year I was born, and it was enormous now, shading the whole front of the house in the summer, going spectacularly orange in October, dropping leaves my father no longer had the knees to rake, and which the landscaping service I had been paying for handled every fall. And I took 3 deliberate breaths, and I went in. My mother opened the door before I knocked, which meant she had been watching from the window. She was wearing the blue sweater I associated with Sundays, and her expression was doing several things at once: warmth, anxiety, a practiced version of normalcy that was slightly too constructed to be fully convincing. She said, "Come in, sweetheart," and the word sat differently in the air now, carrying its recent history. My father was in the living room, in his usual chair, the brown leather one near the window, that had been his for at least 20 years, positioned to catch the morning light.
He looked up when I came in, and he looked, I thought, tired in a specific way that was less about sleep and more about the particular weariness of a person anticipating a conversation they would prefer not to have. And Lauren was on the couch. Lauren being there was something I had assumed would happen, but had not confirmed, and seeing her in person, in that room, with that particular expression on her face, careful and slightly apologetic, and with a quality underneath both that I was trying to read, tightened something in my chest. I sat down in the chair across from the couch. My mother sat beside Lauren. My father remained in his chair. 4 people in a living room with 30 years of shared history, and a piece of paper somewhere that had changed the meaning of all of it. "Thank you for coming," my mother said, which was a choice of words I noted, thanking me for coming to my own parents' house, as if this were a formal occasion, as if the normal framing had already shifted. "Of course," I said. I put my bag on the floor beside my chair. I folded my hands in my lap. I remembered what Margaret had said. Let them expose their position completely.
"I'd like to hear your reasoning," I said. "Why Lauren? And why you didn't tell me?" My father cleared his throat. He was the one who spoke first, which surprised me slightly. My mother generally managed the relational conversations in this family, while my father managed the practical ones. But he leaned forward in his chair and he looked at me directly, and he said, with the sincerity of someone who has decided to be honest even when honesty is difficult, "We should have told you. That's the first thing. We should have told you, and we didn't, and that was wrong." The acknowledgement landed in the room with a weight that silence followed. My mother's hands, in her lap, moved slightly, the way hands move when someone is resisting an impulse. Lauren was looking at her knees. My father continued. "The reasoning—" He paused. "Lauren's situation is different from yours, Kate. You know that. You've always known that. She's had a harder time financially, and we worried about what would happen to her long-term if we weren't here. We didn't worry about you in the same way, because—" He stopped again. "Because you've always been capable. You've always managed." I let him finish.
I waited a beat after he finished to make sure the sentence was complete. Then I said, very quietly, "Dad, I've been paying your electric bill for 38 months. He blinked. "And your gas, and your cell phones, and the landscaping service every year. Do you know how much that is?" He looked at me. "Approximately $18,000, I said, "over 4 years, while you were in a meeting with your financial planner, deciding that the estate goes to Lauren because she needs it more." The room was very still. My father's expression had shifted into something I could only describe as stricken, not defensive, not argumentative, but genuinely stricken, the expression of a person who is seeing a calculation they hadn't made and finding it changes the picture significantly. My mother's hands had gone completely still in her lap. "I didn't realize," my mother began. "Yes, you did," I said, not unkindly. "You called me last week about the electric bill. You called me because you expected me to handle it, which means on some level you knew I was handling things. You just didn't connect that to anything requiring acknowledgement." I paused. "I'm not here to be repaid. I'm here to understand why what I've given counts as nothing and what Lauren needs is the governing principle." Lauren spoke then. She had been quiet for the entirety of the conversation to that point, sitting with her hands folded and that careful, apologetic expression. And when she spoke, her voice was low and had something in it that I wasn't yet sure was genuine or managed. "I didn't know about the auto pay," she said. "I didn't know you were paying those things." A pause. "Mom mentioned the landscaping once, but I didn't know the scope of it." Another pause, longer. "And I I didn't ask them to do the will the way they did it. We talked about it, but I didn't push for it. I looked at my sister. I thought about whether I believed her. Did you know before I did? I asked. A silence that lasted too long to be comfortable. Yes, she said. And then, I should have told you. The second silence in the room was different from the first. The first had been my father's acknowledgement landing.
This one was Lauren's admission landing, and it landed on me specifically, in the specific location in the chest reserved for the people you have known your whole life, and whose failures arrive differently from strangers' failures, because they have so much more access to the places where you can be hurt. I looked at Lauren and I thought about growing up in this house together, about the specific texture of a sister relationship, the borrowed clothes and the shared secrets, and the arguments that only siblings have, the particular intimacy of people who share the earliest version of each other. And I felt the grief of that alongside the anger, because both were present and true, and pretending one didn't exist in the name of the other would have been a lie. Why didn't you tell me? I asked her. She looked at her hands. Because I didn't want to have this conversation, she said finally, and I knew if I told you, we'd have to have it. There was nothing false about that answer. It was the honest answer, and honest answers have a particular texture that you can feel, even when they're the ones you've least wanted. I sat with it for a moment.
Then I said, so instead you let me find out from Aunt Patricia at Pauline's birthday dinner. My mother made a sound. Patricia, she said, in a tone that was trying to redirect toward grievance and not quite managing it. Patricia told me the truth when you hadn't, I said. That's not Patricia's failing. I looked back at my father. I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it completely. I'm not going to fight the will. That's your decision to make, and it's legal, and I understand that. But I also want you to understand that the arrangement we've had for 4 years, where I was quietly handling your bills every month, is over. Not as punishment, as a recognition of reality. If the estate is going to Lauren because Lauren needs it more, then Lauren can contribute to the practical things that need contributing to. That's just logic. My father nodded. He nodded slowly, and his expression was still stricken, but there was something else in it now. Something that looked like a man who was reassessing his own reasoning in real time and finding it less solid than it had appeared when they were making the decision in a financial planner's office. That's fair, he said.
His voice was quiet. That's completely fair, Kate. My mother opened her mouth. I could see the impulse forming, the impulse to manage the situation back towards something more comfortable, to introduce qualifications or context, or the particular brand of, but you have to understand, that she was very skilled at deploying. She looked at my father, and then at Lauren, and then at me, and something in my expression, the steadiness of it, the absence of any invitation to negotiate, stopped her. She closed her mouth. The silence stretched for a moment, and then she said, in a voice that was smaller than I had ever heard from her, "I'm sorry, Kate. I should have talked to you." I want to tell you that this apology resolved everything. I want to tell you that the grief and the anger collapsed into relief and understanding, and that we sat in that living room and reconstructed something. That would be a cleaner story. What actually happened was more complicated and more real. I accepted the apology, genuinely, in the sense that I heard it as sincere and acknowledged it as the necessary thing to say.
But I also understood, sitting in that chair in the living room I had grown up in, that an apology addresses what happened, not what had been built over years, the specific calculus that had decided incrementally and without examination that I was the one who managed and Lauren was the one who needed, and that these were permanent and unquestioned categories. That calculus was what I was actually dealing with, and an apology, however genuine, did not dismantle a calculus. Only behavior would do that. But here is where the next twist arrived, the one I had not anticipated, the one that arrived 2 weeks after that Saturday conversation and changed the shape of everything again. My father called me on a Wednesday evening. My father never initiated calls on weekdays. That was always my mother's domain. And so the call already had a different quality before he said a word. His voice was steady but careful, the voice of a man who has made a decision he's not entirely sure about and is executing it anyway.
He said he wanted to tell me something, and that he was telling me without my mother knowing he was calling, because he needed to tell me without the call becoming a managed thing. He told me that 3 days after the Saturday conversation, he had called their estate attorney. He had gone to the meeting alone. He had not told my mother until after. He had told the attorney that he wanted to revise the will, not to divide the estate equally, he said, because there were practical reasons related to Lauren's situation that he still believed were real, but to include a specific bequest to me that accounted for the 4 years of financial contributions and the condo disparity. He had done the math himself, he said, sitting at his desk with a notepad the evening before the attorney appointment. The total he had arrived at, including the estimate of the condo down payment, the landscaping, the bills, and a factor for what he called the principle of the thing, was $62,000. The attorney had drafted a bequest for that amount. My father had signed it. The will had been updated. He told me this in a steady, careful voice, and when he finished, he said, "I should have seen it sooner, Kate. I'm sorry it took your cutting off the lights for me to see it." The particular self-deprecating precision of that phrase, cutting off the lights, made something in my throat tighten in a way that the Saturday confrontation had not. I held the phone and breathed for a moment. Then I said, "Thank you, Dad. That means a lot." And I meant it, and the meaning was real and complicated, and not simple enough to be called happiness, but too genuine to be called anything less. But there was a third layer, and it arrived not from my father, but from Lauren, and it arrived in a form I had not predicted. Lauren called me 10 days after my father's call. She did not know about the call, as far as I could determine, and asked if she could come over. I said yes. She came on a Saturday afternoon with a bottle of wine she had clearly chosen with care, and the expression of a person who has been rehearsing something and is now going to attempt to say it without the rehearsal showing.
We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I drink my morning coffee, and she poured the wine and she looked at me and she said, "I've been thinking about this every day since we talked. I need you to know that I set up a direct payment to Mom and Dad's electric account, monthly, starting this month." She paused. "And I called about the internet." Another pause. "The cell phones I can cover starting next month when my current billing cycle adjusts." She was looking at me steadily, and her voice was doing the thing voices do when they are carrying more than the words, and the additional weight was something that looked like an attempt at repair. "I know this doesn't fix the whole thing," she said, "but I needed to do something real." I looked at my sister across my kitchen table. I thought about the 11-year-old version of her, the one who used to come into my room late at night when she was scared of something and curl up next to me in my bed without asking, and the way I had always moved over to make room. I thought about the adult version sitting across from me now, who had known about the will and had let me find out from someone else, who had let the situation go uncorrected for weeks after it broke open, and who was sitting here now with a bottle of good wine and a set of payments she had quietly arranged, and the expression of someone trying, genuinely, in the imperfect and belated way of people who are better at repair than at prevention. "Okay," I said, and then, after a moment, "Thank you." She nodded. We drank the wine. We talked for 2 hours, carefully and honestly, and with the specific tenderness that belongs to people who have hurt each other and are choosing to remain anyway, which is different from forgetting and different from forgiving completely, and is its own real thing. The domino effect of that Saturday conversation, and the phone call about the electric bill, and the 11 seconds of silence, continued to unfold in ways I hadn't entirely planned. My mother, who had spent the 2 weeks following the Saturday visit in what I can only describe as a state of anxious recalibration, called me on a Thursday evening and asked if I would come to dinner on Sunday. She said it in a way that was different from her usual Sunday dinner invitations, less breezy, more careful, with a quality of genuine asking rather than assumed compliance. I said yes. At the Sunday dinner, my mother cooked the meal I had loved since childhood, pot roast,
the specific version with the carrots and the potatoes and the particular herb combination that smelled exactly like every winter Sunday of my life. And she set the table with the china, which she reserved for occasions that mattered. And we had dinner, the four of us, in a way that was tentative and slightly formal, and also real, in the way that things which have been through a rupture and are attempting repair have a particular realness that the unruptured version doesn't quite possess. My mother said, over the pot roast, that she wanted to start a conversation about how things would work going forward, who paid what, how it would be talked about, how the disparity would be acknowledged rather than silently sustained. She said disparity with the careful precision of someone who has been thinking about a word and deciding it was the right one.
I thought about the years of Kate always figures it out, and nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart, and the financial planner meeting, and the signed document. I thought about how much had gone unspoken in this family for so long. Not from malice, I had never believed it was from malice, but from the particular discomfort of conversations that require people to name what they have done and what they have not done, and the preference for the comfortable ambient arrangement over the difficult specific one. I thought about how much energy all of us had spent maintaining the ambient arrangement, and how it had collapsed in 9 minutes of canceled auto payments and one phone call, and how the collapse, painful as it was the first honest thing that had happened between us in years. Yes, I said to my mother. Let's have that conversation. And we had it, at that dining room table with the good china and the pot roast, and it was imperfect and incomplete, and the beginning of something rather than the resolution of it. And I had brought my notepad with the numbers, and we looked at them together, and my father said 62,000 out loud, in a voice that made my mother press her hand to her mouth for a moment, and Lauren looked at the tablecloth. And I let all of it be what it was. The months that followed were the months of rebuilding, which is slower and quieter and less dramatic than the breaking, and which requires a sustained attention that is harder in some ways than any single confrontation. I want to tell you what they looked like in their specifics, because the specifics matter, and the epilogue of a story like this is not a single scene, but an accumulation of smaller ones. Lauren did what she said she would do. The payments went in, I know because my father mentioned them in a conversation 2 months later, not with fanfare, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has seen a situation he helped create begin to correct itself.
Lauren's coverage wasn't identical to mine in scale, because her finances were genuinely tighter than mine, but it was consistent, and it was maintained, and there is a specific respectability to consistency that is worth acknowledging. We talked more than we had before the rupture, Lauren and I, not constantly, not without the occasional awkwardness of two people who are still learning a new configuration of themselves, but with a frankness that the earlier version of our relationship had not quite had, the frankness that comes from having had the conversation you were both avoiding and having survived it. My parents changed. Not completely. People do not change completely, and anyone who tells you that a difficult family conversation produced a complete transformation is either lying or hasn't looked carefully yet. But in specific, observable ways, my parents changed. My mother stopped using sweetheart as an administrative tool, or perhaps she still used it, but the tone had shifted, the honey-warm management quality replaced by something slightly more direct and slightly more uncertain, which paradoxically felt more genuine. My father called me more. Not always for a purpose, sometimes just to talk. About his garden, about the book he was reading, about a documentary he had watched. Those calls had a different quality from the weekly Sunday call that my mother orchestrated. They felt, in their small, unhurried way, like a father and daughter learning how to talk to each other after a long period of talking around each other. There was the morning in October, 4 months after the electric bill call, when I went to visit and my father was in the garden. The landscaping service had done the fall cleanup. The maple tree was fully orange. The garden was its end-of-season self, going quiet in the particular peaceful way of things that have done their work and are resting.
I stood on the back porch and watched him check on a rose bush he had been nursing back from something, crouching despite his knees, examining a branch with his usual devoted attention. And I thought about the rooster clock in the kitchen, and the pot roast, and 34 years of Sundays in this house, and the blue stoneware mug with the chipped handle that had been with me since grad school, and the maple tree my father had planted the year I was born, which was now enormous and entirely itself. I went out and stood beside him and looked at the rosebush, too. He said, without looking up, "She's going to come back in spring." I said, "I think you're right." We stood there for a while in the particular comfortable silence of two people who don't need to fill it, which was new for us, or not new but newly available, newly unlocked by the months of difficult things having been said. I had the blue stoneware mug on my kitchen counter every morning. It had been there through all of it. Through the night I sat with Melissa and Thai food. Through the 4 a.m.
tea that preceded Saturday, through the Wednesday evening of my father's phone call, through every morning that had been part of this long, difficult, necessary sequence. It was chipped on the handle and had a small brown stain near the rim that had never quite washed out, and it was mine in the way that things you have carried through your own life become entirely yours. I made coffee every morning at 6:40. I stood at the counter and watched the light change on the buildings across the street, and I thought about the day ahead. The mornings were still mine. That had always been the thing. All of it had always been mine. My management, my capability, my quiet contributions, my discipline, my willingness to figure it out. What had changed was that I had said so, and the saying of it, uncomfortable and irrevocable, had been the only way to make any of the rest of it possible. I poured my coffee into the chipped blue mug, and I drank it at my kitchen window, and it was exactly as good as it had always been, and it was entirely my own.
My